Very, very good. Okay, so let's jump right in with the title of our roundtable. So can you please tell attendees about why each of you chose to study economics? Let's start off with Andrea.
Sure. So my interest in economics is twofold. One, I was fortunate to be introduced to economics in high school, which I know for a lot of people that's not where you first encounter economics. And at that age, I really just liked the way it was presented. It was kind of this nice stew of human psychology and math and business ideas and sociology, and that really appealed to me. So that's kind of where the interest started. But as I went on to college, I started thinking about whether this was practical or not, right? And when you grow up in kind of a poorer family, there's kind of a lot of pressure on you to do well for the benefit of the family. And I kind of second guessed whether economics was the right decision because I was looking for something that would have kind of more immediate market payoffs. Of course, I didn't understand what the income potential was for economics at that point. But then I still kept taking economics classes, and after I took kind of the intro level classes, I took an economic development course, and that's really where my heart changed because I really saw potential in the discipline to give me the tools to, not just, do well for my family, but to actually affect change in my community and in my country. And so that's really what grabbed me is kind of the potential to make a difference for my community and for my country.
Thanks so much. Okay, do you want to come in?
Were you asking me, Sandila? Sorry. So one, thank you so much for the opportunity to join this spectacular roundtable today. I stalk most of the people here, including Siobhan. And I think, it's high time that we sort of make our personal experiences sort of connect for the students who are, visiting with us in a virtual sense around the world today. For me, I felt the choice of economics was more of a rational choice. I came to the US as an international student. Most people will hear my accent from Trinidad. So coming from, poor background, first generation attended community college, working as a babysitter to pay my tuition. I didn't have a ton of resources. So I needed to, one, ensure that the field of study or the major that I chose had some longevity to it and some potential payoff that I could go back home or return to my family table and say, hey, I did it. Because for us culturally, right, if you're not a doctor or you're not an attorney, you pretty much, you're not doing anything spectacular. So you've got to really deliver. And so for me, it's like, what could I have chosen that in addition to meeting those objective financial criteria, also meet my passion. I'm extremely passionate. I'm driven by social justice issues. And at least starting out, I thought that choosing economics would be the perfect field to blend this need to give back, need to sort of study issues that I was most concerned about, need to sort of find ways to advance policy solutions, for example, I'm from an oil producing country. So back then, 20 years ago, concerned about, when these resources start running out, what do we turn to next? And so those kinds of questions, not fully formed, and it got me started on my pathway to economics. And going from community college, that's where I started off, and getting to my four-year institution at Hunter College in New York. And I feel like there was I had one of the most formative experiences in my first class, Principles of Microeconomics, when a white professor says, raise your hand if you haven't had calculus. He had no idea that my pathway had already created a ceiling through which I would never reach calculus because I started off at community college. And so, he's like, hey, I expect you to drop this class by this afternoon. My obstinance, my lack of resources, my, budget constraint determined for me that that was not a possibility and kept me going. And then sort of, stepping into my career, I, found the most, I think, non-linear paths through economics and have been flourishing ever since. I'm hoping to dive into more of those experiences to share with the young students who are joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks. Sharon?
So my introduction to economics was a bit non-traditional. It really was through the area that I specialize in now, which is economic history. And the first course I took was with a former labor director for the NAACP. And it was talking about just the trajectory of Black workers in the economy over time. And that is very different as an introduction to economics than what we usually see in sort of your principles of economics course, which is about supply and demand and market equilibrium and elasticities and these more general concepts. And that was very abstract. And so I think it's important when we introduce economics to students, and so why economics, I saw the importance of economics not as something that's sort of a building block for business or something else, but really something that can explain the social inequality that we might see and try to have some policies around at present, but also more importantly, to see them as a long run evolution of a social process that has deep historical roots. And so that introduction to economics led me to be very interested in how the economy operated today, and then how this operation today is really a function of decisions and policies that are instituted sometimes hundreds of years in the past that align with sort of political economy and a much broader range of issues than you will see contained in a very sort of tight introduction to principles of economics coursework.
Thanks. And I'm getting a similar theme of the importance of the introduction, and in particular that very, very first course, and what economics looks like to you and what topics are even covered in that first instance. Benga, do you want to come in with your experience of how you came into Econ?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because my experience was not like anyone who's described theirs. So I started out at Berkeley, go Bears, as a math major. I just really enjoyed math, but it was too abstract. So I was like, well, what do I want to apply it to? So I thought about computer science, but I hated programming, and then got to economics. And one of the things was I've always been motivated by, making change and policy and politics. And I thought, well, economics would be a good way of doing that. But I never really got that sense as an undergrad. And even in my grad program, I still was like searching for something that wasn't there. But I guess being stubborn, I was like, but there's got to be a way to answer that question. And so I got to the University of Toledo, was there for 15 years, did a lot of research, police militarization, race, and local public goods. But again, with the publication, and I love teaching, but again, I still didn't feel I was making a big enough contribution, or I was not able to really hit that. And so I did a fellowship at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., focusing on criminal justice. And then I was going to go back to Toledo, but I got this opportunity at the Center for American Progress, which is a progressive think tank. And it's here where I've kind of finally hit my stride, where I've been able to do work and be able to kind of provide that link between academic work and policy, and be able to I think of my job as translation and dissemination. We take the journal articles and then translate it to the policy world. And so this is where I finally felt like this econ background, this training, all these 20 years I've been as an economist has led me to this moment.
I love that you've been able to connect the dots and close the circle. Laura, why don't you come in?
Yeah, I love hearing everybody's stories and their paths. I think there are similarities and dissimilarities, but probably the theme of seeking a vocation that allows us to affect positive change is common across them. For a long time, personally, I did not choose economics. I did not major in economics. I actually didn't take a single economics course as an undergrad, so I'm kind of outing myself that way now. I majored in gender studies, and I minored in molecular biology. And the reason was that I cared passionately about social justice and questions of inequality, and at the same time drawn to quantitative and scientific methods. And to be totally honest, I did not see economics as containing the intersection of those two interests. To me, and at my college, economics was for people looking to make more money, not looking to make positive change in the world. And I was a senior in college, deep in mathematical biology coursework. So I was at that time working with these evolutionary game theory models. But unlike my classmates who were modeling what we were supposed to be modeling, how viruses and proteins interact in the body, I was replacing the agents with workers and bosses in these repeated games, dividing the surplus of their match. And it really was almost a coincidence that I ran into an economist and I sought out his feedback on my project. And he just kind of stared at me and said, "Have you heard of economics?" And I thought, but that's not, for me. And he said, "No, it's a toolkit. You can answer any question you want." And he planted a seed, and it took a long time for me to give in. 4 years later, I enrolled in a PhD program in economics after trying many other vocations. And what really made the difference for me was exposure to people doing work that I found transformative. And those were economic historians working on the economic history of slavery, working on power and how that affects the distribution of resources. And that's, what really drove me. And I, today I've never looked back. If I were to, have this choice offered again and again, I would always choose economics because I find it to be my vocation. It's a field where I'm constantly being challenged, constantly being forced to sharpen my thinking. So I ever go back, but I often think about how it's basically pure chance that I ended up here. So I'm hoping that this event will, reach those who might have been in a similar position as me many years ago.
Thanks so much to all of you for sharing those really inspiring vignettes. What strikes me is that some of you certainly chose Econ, but for others like Alora, it seems like Econ chose you. And what they also highlighted is really the nonlinearity in some of our narratives, which is that, even if you haven't necessarily majored in Econ right now, or if you feel like that you don't have the math coursework in order to go into graduate study, that there are other paths that can still bring you to this point. Now, what's unfortunate is that the stories that we've heard today from the panelists are so rare within the econ profession. It's not often that we get to be in a room full of economists that really looks the way that this room looks like right now. And so for students that are considering majoring or pursuing a graduate degree in econ, what advice do you have on navigating what's sometimes, quite honestly, a complicated road, given the discipline struggles with inclusion? And maybe I'll turn first to Andrea on this.
So it's so again, to kind of go back into my story and how I navigated that, I ended up in institutions that were mostly white, that were, mostly, they subscribe to the abstract neoclassical way of thinking about the economy. And so I struggled a lot in that pipeline, and because I wasn't finding what I was looking for in the discipline, right? I kept studying and saying maybe the next class will do it. I always tell the story. In graduate school, I literally took a math course it's dynamic optimization, but it's literally the equations that they use to send rockets into space. And and that's interesting for some people, but that's not what I was looking for. And it's almost like the lens that I was being given in economics, it instead of kind of making the world clear to me, it was distorting the world, because I could sense that there was something off between what I was being taught and what the world looks like. And so I struggled a long time to persist. And even though I made the commitment very young that I liked economics and wanted to study it, there were so many times along the path that I almost gave up, deciding to choose other disciplines or to drop out, because I felt like this is not what I thought it would be. And I'm glad I persisted, because it is what I thought it could be, right? It's just the way it's presented to you, it distorts what it really can be. And so for people who are thinking or considering it, my advice is to want to persist, but you always kind of have to do your own work. And this week I was reading a paper by James Baldwin where he talks about this education paradox, where society has certain objectives and it usually wants to perpetuate its own aims. But if you're an educated person, your goal should be to essentially disrupt society, to force progress and change in society. But our education does not prepare us to do that, especially if you go in the traditional educational route. So for a lot of people, especially if you're in a traditional economics department, you have to do your own independent study. And when I went through grad school, I thought, I have all this knowledge about math and optimization and but I didn't know how am I going to change my world with math, right? And so I kind of had to do my own unlearning and learning outside of the discipline. And I really have been able to bring myself to the place where I thought I could go with economics. And of course, it's kind of a road I'm traveling, and I feel like I'm getting closer to where I wanted to be when I initially started. So my advice is to keep persistent, do your own independent work, read widely, read philosophy and sociology and history. You cannot just depend on the economics coursework, right? In the traditional sense. So that's what I would say. Persist, because we need you. We need your perspective in the discipline.
Fully aligned. Thank you for that. What particularly touched a nerve on my end was, as Black woman, for myself as a first gen, also as a queer woman, the world of theory and empirics and econ certainly did not reflect my day-to-day experience. And it's only been through our work that, we make economics, both theory and empirics, really reflect what we know the world to be. And that's just a huge contribution.
Exactly.
Makeda, can you also comment on this?
Sure. As I listen to everyone's story here and even to Andrew's response, I hear this undercurrent, actually not even undercurrent, very, very present theme of randomness, luck, and chance, and also supply side solutions. I think we ought to reframe the question and ask, how can we who have persevered, because as a Black woman economist, my experience both professionally and as well as in the academy has been a story of perseverance, not necessarily one of continual success. And so for the few who've had that linear path of success and career progression, how do we turn around and make the economics profession a welcoming, habitable place for minority economists, Black women, and Indigenous American women as well? And I say that because there's very little place in our discipline for the kinds of questions that I'm interested in. Yes, intergenerational mobility, but a lot of our work is done from the perspectives of fathers and sons. We have a lot of data now that we can start changing our perspective and ask, if my career path changes, how does that inform the life trajectory of my daughter and that of her daughters from here on out? So this has to be not only on the onus of students, because I've carried that burden for all the young women on this call. It's time to change the question and start asking, what can we do as gatekeepers to ensure that there's a place for the kinds of intersectional questions that we are interested in doing? I mean, I've listened to some of the roles that we've all played. Economics provides us with tools. It's a vocation. It's, we translate, we disseminate. It's not a be all and end all thing. We are actually so, malleable, and we can kind of fit into different spaces because of the unique skill sets and perspectives and the training that we have. But a lot of our work kind of our training develops in silos. We're in the midst of a historic civil racial moment in my lifetime. And I've had to sit back and reflect on my own training. How did I, insert race as a binary variable in a linear regression and expect it to tell me something? That's not the way, when it comes to other sorts of more, sophisticated analysis, dynamism and Hamiltonians, all this other stuff, we think very differently. But when it comes to race, it's just an afterthought. So I think, it's high time that we acknowledge that it is our responsibility in the academy, as well as in the think tank space, public policy, and in government, to create a space for minority economists. And it's not to tell you that your questions aren't quite right. That's not the way economics, research or rigorous empirical work is done. And some of this battle has to be fought in the scholarly journals as well, with the reviewers and editors and everybody else who's part of this sort of gatekeeping function.
Yes, thank you so much for emphasizing the demand side of it. You know, you're making me want to like get my poster board out and do a one-woman march around DC. The demand side is all important. Do any of the other panelists want to quickly come on in on this before I move to the next question?
One thing I want to add is community is so important in finding your community. And one of the beautiful things, so, you know, there's a National Economic Association, the AA Minority Program, there's a lot of pipeline programs. But one of the great things about that is a lot of us, I know, in our going through, felt alone at some point. But we all probably had certain mentors. So for me, it was Rhonda Sharp, who was a couple years before me in my grad program at Claremont Graduate University, who I can tell you I would not be here if it wasn't for her. And so then after that, there's groups like, you know, there was a program, Diet, where I met Trevon, people like Derek Hamilton, a lot of the people who, it's like, oh, I'm not in this by myself. That you could talk about these things, you could have these questions, you could say, okay, am I wrong or is the world wrong? And it's like, no, the world is wrong. And so one of the biggest things to find, and there's places out there, is find a community of people, like-minded people. And that's what's going to help you get through, help you to persevere, and help you to, and also see success. People ahead of you or success, and then people who will celebrate your own successes, which is really nice.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, community. I mean, and I even think back to my undergraduate days. I attended Spelman College, and you know, not only just students, but also my professors that I'm still in touch with, that really pulled me through, you know, the hardest moments of navigating this path. So thanks for that addition. So let's move forward. So in many ways, I feel really fortunate to do the work that we do. We have immense influence on our understanding of the economy and therefore on how policies are designed and what policies are implemented. So if I can turn to Laura, Trevon, and Benga, can you share your most impactful moment? So that one day, that 1 year where you were just like, everything's hitting and I'm actually seeing the translation of all of this effort into the lives of people all around the world. So let's start with Laura.
Yeah, so I'm, first and foremost an economic historian. So we don't typically necessarily expect to have influence on policy, depending on what period we study, et cetera. But for me, this moment definitely came in while I was working on the historical evolution of the minimum wage in the US and dynamics in racial inequality. And so my co-author, who's also at Berkeley, Claire Montialou, and we were combining our interests by looking at effects of minimum wages in a historical context. And we stumbled upon this striking fact that in 1967 in the US, when the minimum wage was expanded to sectors that had been previously uncovered, that weren't covered by the minimum wage, Black workers benefited hugely. And that policy actually helped close racial earnings gaps. And this was because the law was being extended to industries that had an overrepresentation of Black workers, and there is a very strong racialized political economy behind that. And Black workers are overrepresented in the lower part of wage distribution. So those two things combined meant that this was a great leap forward in racial convergence, and it was a first order factor in convergence in the only period of racial earnings convergence since 1950. And, it was very clear why this policy ended up having that effect. This is a segregated labor market, and labor markets today are still racially very segregated. So we think that the fundamentals really actually are still true today. And policymakers ended up picking up on our findings. So we were able to meet with a congressional committee, and we were able to publish an op-ed based on our research, arguing that in the New York Times, arguing that if you are really serious about reducing racial disparities today in this year of an uprising around racial justice, here is a policy that we really need to put on the table. So I'm still hoping to see, depending on what happens with politics that might come to fruition, but it was really exciting. It was, maybe the most exciting moment ever to have that work have influence in that way.
Fantastic. Trevon, do you want to come in?
Probably the biggest moment for me was being asked, and I have now been asked by several national organizations to come and talk about the historical case for reparations, which is something that, beginning of my career and really moving to racial topics, I would have told you no one would want to touch it. It was a sort of a toxic, it was nuclear, it was a sort of nuclear waste in a sense politically. And so working on these topics about the destruction of Black wealth, about, as Alora mentioned, the political economy and a racialized political economy, particularly in the research that I've done in the post-emancipatory period, about opportunities that were lost and, in fact, transfers of wealth that were made to everyone but African Americans. And now to see that there is a national conversation about how a debt is owed to African Americans and what that debt is, and the usefulness of economic history to really answer a contemporary policy question about why we have these racial wealth gaps and the historical roots of them. And so it isn't really an aha moment, but to see something emerge as an issue that is talked about, say, in the presidential primaries for the Democratic Party on the debate stage, something that, 15 years ago, people told you, why are you even discussing this? Why are you even saying this word out of your mouth? Really shows the possibility of perseverance, which is another point that was raised earlier, and to continue along this research trajectory. And it also says something about the need for this profession to be diverse, because this is not a topic that a lot of other people in the field are talking about. This really is something that is laid in the groundwork of African-American economists more broadly. It's not something that has been given to us. It is something that we have brought to the table. So it's very important as a diversity issue to have that range of researchers who are willing to talk about these issues to a broader population.
Yeah, thanks for that. What strikes me about both of your moments is, Alora is basically waiting for hers to materialize. Started this work years ago, and now it's starting to bubble to the surface. So there is a sense that even if there's not an immediate turnaround in terms of policy impact for your work, that if you keep at it, if you keep the conversation, if you keep the seat warm, that it will materialize eventually. Benka, do you want to come in with your Zen moment?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was thinking about this, and so I started at CAP about 2.5 years ago, so right in the middle of the Trump administration. So I was like, I don't think I've had an impact, because nothing's changed. Things have gotten worse. But one of the things we talked about taking a long time is that and one of the things I found working in the policy world is that you can't come in and say, oh, here's a policy, we need to change it. You have to lay the groundwork for it. And you do it, you keep laying the groundwork. And at some point, when the moment happens, it's like, voila. And so I was going to actually talk about my rural work, but I just thought of a better example. So January 2019, for Jobs Day, every day is Jobs Day, and everyone talks about the national unemployment rate and these jobs and all this stuff. I was like, well, you know what? I can't get into that space. Like, I can't compete with people there because people have done it for a long time. But I can focus on the Black-white unemployment gap, because that's been there forever, and that's not going to change. But people need to talk about it. People need to hear about it. So January 2019, I just said every Jobs Day, I'm going to tweet the gap and just say, hey, let's pay attention. And so now we're November 2020. And over about the last couple months, people have actually started noticing it and talking about it, to the point now where people people now on NPR, New York Times are like, oh, we need to talk about the Black unemployment rate. Let's get Benga. And so, but now this is like 1.5 years of just yelling into the void. But at some point, people do listen. And so I think, and actually I was just listening to Marketplace yesterday, and they were interviewing John Williams, I think, at New York Fed. And he was like, well, the unemployment rate looks pretty decent. And then Kai Rizal said, but what about Black unemployment rate? That's at 10%. And I was like, yes, finally. And so I guess that's one of those things where when you lay the groundwork, it's, and then that brings up to Trevon's point, is that's why we are needed. because we're going to think of things, we're going to look at aspects that are going to be ignored. And so if we are bringing those things up, then when the moment's right, our work, all the stuff we've done is going to be there for people to pick up and mainstream and then actually to, possibly affect change.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, the reason that I talk about the racial unemployment gap is because of you too. So thank you for that contribution and for staying at it. So before I bring in some of the other questions that are coming through, and I encourage other attendees to continue adding your questions to the Q&A in the chat, I want to end on the point in terms of this moderated discussion on the future. So I do wonder, what are your visions for the future of econ? Let's say a decade from now, so in 2030, what does econ look like? Do the rooms look more like this room today? Is there other elements of diversity and inclusion that are brought in? What are we studying? And in particular, if you can speak to the aspiring economists that are on the call, how do you see them fitting into these imagined futures? And maybe I'll start with you, Makeda, on this one.
Man, I like these futuristic exercises. So in 2030, I see that the representation of Black women with PhDs in economics would have increased 1,000-fold. Yes, right. In 2016, Black and Indigenous women just earned just under, I think it's like 3.7% of all econ PhDs. To make any sort of transformative change in any of the discussions that we've had thus far, we've got to be present in a critical mass around the table. And that table ought to be made up of economists, from different pathways. I think we have to permit ourselves to allow, some of this elitism around economists, who economists are, and where they're allowed to breathe, where they're allowed to contribute. We have to, be more inclusive as a discipline. Currently, we're not. So when you ask, the previous question, I was thinking, when was my most impactful moment? When did that, aha moment occur to me? It occurred to me in the midst of, my life as a public servant with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's when I saw my training meet the social justice issues I cared about, and also deliver impact to millions of consumers. So that's the other sort of vision for 2030. Economics has to be unsiloed. We have to train our students from day one, like Dr. Logan, and I wish I could go back and rewind the clock and change some of my training. I want us to train our economists, our future students, and have them steeped in political science, have their training steeped in sociological constructs, because race is a bundle of sticks. It is not this thing that is independent and sort of, operates on its own, a light switch we can turn on and off. It is encoded in so much of our, public data sets, our variables, our models. And so the siloed way that we approach our work and our thinking in itself, forecloses all of the rich potential for research that is still sort of locked and trapped within our brains. That's my dream, right? It's not just about proportional representation of the bodies on the table, but it really means, we've got to diversify the kinds of research and scholarship, as well as the places where economists are welcome and are valued. So that's my utopia.
That's beautiful, fully aligned. And also what I took from that is that it's not about diversity and inclusion as an end, but really as a means to improve everybody's lives. Yeah. Andrea, why don't you come in and give your vision of the future in 2030?
Sure. So, of course, all the great things that Makeda envisions, that I am there as well. But I would add to that, one, just expand on the idea of the way we teach economics. I hope that Black students who study economics in the future can actually, learn the truth about what the world looks like. And of course, there's a place for the math, and the analytical thinking, but I do hope that there's the space and the opportunity made for the teaching and the learning of economics to just be true and to to incorporate equity and justice in it, right? Instead of these ideas out there, I hope core Econ 101 centers, issues around equity and justice and mobility and what is the purpose of wealth, right? So that's what I hope on the one hand. On the second hand, I do hope that people are experiencing an economy that will deliver on those ideals, right? So I hope that for us as Black people, we don't die 10 years younger. And I hope that our homes are not undervalued just because of the color of our skin. And I hope that we don't pay higher interest rates just because of where we come from or what we look like. And, I hope that our children can go to good quality schools so that they can, experience life in a full way. And then lastly, I hope, especially for the young people on the call, I hope that you understand that, this world is yours as well. And you get a chance. It is your right to help determine the world. And I hope that you will be encouraged and inspired to take up that mantle and not kind of, slink back from that. It is your world. Help to design it, help to create it. Because if you don't step into those spaces, other people will who don't care about the issues you care about, or people who are even antagonistic to the vision we have for society. And I do believe that, a lot of what we're talking about today, we care about the public good. We don't just care about wealth for ourselves. We want the world to be a better place. And, if you want to do good things for the world, I hope that you will feel empowered to step into that role. And I do think economics is a perfect way to do that, where we can change it. And I hope that, 10 years, of course, we're dreaming here, right? But I hope that all of this comes true within 10 years. Okay, I'm just dreaming here.
I share in all of your hopes. and actually what you talked about, it's especially in terms of the topics that we end up covering and dealing with some of the introductory hurdles, if you will, into econ. That's actually a perfect segue into our open Q&A. And I'll open this up to all panels. So we have one question coming in, which is, how were you able to balance some of econ's flawed and oppressive assumptions with your lived experiences and goals? Were there distinct moments where an introductory course or experience felt more aligned to your experience and goals? And maybe if I can ask Trevon to come in on this one, just because earlier you mentioned about the introductory course and how those should be structured going forward.
Yeah, I think when we think about economics in the way that it is structured, it will create, and we have to create some spaces to move outside of the traditional confines of sort of these aracial characters, right? So remember, one of the issues with race is that economics as a field theoretically basically erases it. It's not a field of analysis, and it's not something that is fully incorporated into our theoretical apparatus, right? So immediately you're not going to see Black people, you're not going to see white people, you're not going to see anyone with sort of these racial identities in an economic model. And that itself is problematic if we think about a social science that's going to tell us something about the world. So the first thing we have to think about is, how do we do that theoretically? But I'm not a theorist, so I never necessarily want to start there. So I'll give you a very practical way of thinking about this. Is several years ago, when I was president of the National Economic Association, as Benga has been as well, for my presidential address, I actually answered some questions that economic historians had using some very personal information from my own family. So there are some ways in which the pieces that we have and the things that we are privy to are actually quite important for larger questions in the field, but we don't think about them as sort of being operationalized in the way that the discipline sort of enacts itself. So I think it's really important for us to see ourselves as economic agents, and then literally by force of will legitimize ourselves as economic agents. I think a lot of the work, particularly around racial issues, is inherently defensive about why you'd want to think about racial inequality, why it might be racial animus leading to the racial inequality that you see. And that is really setting up these red herrings that I think it is time for the discipline to move beyond. So we've set up this culture of, is it discrimination, and is it statistical discrimination, or is it taste-based discrimination? These are sort of classic questions in economics. And I'm to the point of moving beyond that. And so I think what I would encourage people to do in the next generation is not to accept these paradigms as truth, but to acknowledge them as sort of paradigms in a scientific discipline. And paradigms do shift. And paradigms shift because of cultural and social change in the scientific community. That's what's really important to understand about why economics looks like it does now and how economics could look like it should look in the future. It requires a paradigm shift, but that then requires our participation and engagement with the discipline.
Fully aligned. So we got another question coming in, and I'm going to throw this to Laura because of your origin story. So it's, does Econ reveal itself when it feels that the right candidate has fulfilled its required path?
That's a great question. I don't think it does. I don't think Econ reveals itself as a path for people from non-traditional backgrounds on its own. And we already talked a lot on this panel about the role of chance and coincidence and randomness, and that's not right. So because of the presence of mentors in the field and of people whose work spoke to me, I was able to find a community and a voice. But we need to increase the number of people in economics who work on these questions that I think are the most critical questions of our moment, questions of inequality, of climate change. We have these pressing societal issues, and we have this toolkit. And yet for decades and decades, I would say that the role that economics has played when we think about the history of thought in economics and the ideology among economists has basically been to justify policies that have worsened inequality, right? So I think the paradigm shift is connected to the needs in economics should be addressed today and going forward. So because it does not reveal itself, we have to sort of build our own path brick by brick. And I think that I hope that events like this can help students find the right networks and the right programs. Please reach out, and I'm happy to connect you with other programs and possibilities for mentorship. So that's how we do this. We all do this together. And we don't want any of you to fall through the cracks. So be in touch.
Thanks so much for that. And I know that Makeda has to step away, so I just want to say thank you so much, Makeda, for joining before you have to leave. And so now just thank you. Just continue with our question. So that your answer on that actually leads into this next question that I'm going to bring up, which is many students feel like the field of economics is an impediment to social justice. But you all discussed how you use it as a tool to create progress. What would you say to someone who's skeptical of the field? And Benga, do you want to come in on this one, given your experience, especially in joining CAP more recently?
Yeah, I mean, the person's not wrong because economists have been an impediment. So being in DC has really soured me on politics. I mean, I'm still into it. I still want to, but I know, but part of it is I know I'm in a position to be able to make change, so I have to be optimistic and have to be hopeful. But economists have been and continue to be very, and as an example, we had the CARES Act and we had that $600 a week benefit that was added. Congress allowed it to expire. And instead of saying, and then there was research done. And one of the cool things about our field becoming more diverse is that people are asking these questions, looking at what happened. And we have the research now to show how that $600 a week worked and help with the economy and help with this, get us through this pandemic. But you have these economists in policy spaces, and we had this whole debate about whether we should do $600 a week or $300 a week or $400 a week, which is the most inane debate possible because there's like 2 million things that we need to do. And to get hung up, and literally this was like on Twitter, in policy spaces, and in politics, like this was like huge, like, and the thing is, since then we've had none. And so while that's frustrating, I think, in 10 years, if there's more of us, that kind of debate is not going to happen. And we're seeing it now with the student debt debate, right? I know Andrew could probably speak better to this, but everyone's talking about, well, is it 10,000 cap? Is it 50? Is it regressive? And it's like, there's so many issues that actually matter, and that you get these people who are divorced from the actual impacts of all these policies. And this is probably one of the biggest reasons, because we see the backgrounds of a lot of people, and more lived experience have a better sense of how these policies actually impact them. And as we have more of us in the policy spaces, there are more of us who understand the impacts of these things, who then actually, but then will have the empirical rigor and background to be able to come through and say, this is why we should do this. And that's what's missing in the policy sphere right now. So having more of us coming out, doing the work, asking the right questions, and having that empirical background. Like, for example, next year, when things aren't going to settle, but when the minimum wage debate comes up, I know I can use Alora's paper because it's in the QJE and to say, hey, this is why we need to do this. And so that's the kind of thing that 2 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to do. And that's a great example of how having more of us is going to help us in the policy atmosphere.
Absolutely. And Andrea, feel free to come in on that as well, especially in the, the contours of the recent student debt debate. But also, if you could also answer this other question that the students raised, which is, what advice do you have to give to an econ graduate student when it comes to research and writing in general while you're in graduate school?
Okay, so I'll kind of address the previous question briefly about being skeptical about economics as kind of a way forward, and economics kind of being an impediment to progress rather than a purveyor of progress. And Benga mentioned this point, like, we're survivors here, right? So we do suffer from survivor bias. Like, the people who were kind of left, who dropped out, they're not here to talk about their experiences in a certain way. But so for the second question about research and writing in graduate school, and this is another issue again about just a lack of representation, and even a lot of economists, prominent people who are very ignorant about the way race works in the economy, right? So you will face people who will discourage you from studying certain topics, but I've had students who email me from other schools, and they'll say, I wanted to study this topic, but I couldn't find an advisor in my department. You will, right? It depends on where you are. You will come up, for things like that. So one, I think if you can in any way be strategic about where you go, right? At least do some research about departments that. You do have departments who do very well, or do better than others on issues about race, just in terms of interpersonal interaction, but also the types of things that people study and are open to, right? So first, before you even get to graduate school, kind of do your research to make sure you go into places that will kind of welcome that. And then second, if you do find yourself in that type of environment, it's tough because at that point, you have two options. You're either going to persevere and kind of keep your eye on the prize. That's kind of what got me through graduate school, where I knew that there was a bigger purpose behind this. I actually viewed graduate school as an obstacle that was fighting me instead of something creating the opportunity for me to move forward in my life and to get to where I wanted to go. So for me, it was always important to kind of keep my mind on what I needed to do. And it's hard because a lot of the coursework that you have to do, even though I felt like it was way too abstract, it was not preparing me for the work I wanted to do, I still had to do it, right? And it's very demanding, it's quantitative, and right, it requires a lot from you. So I almost had to pull double shift in graduate school to learn what I needed to learn so I could jump through those hurdles, but also make sure I'm having my education, my real education, on my own independently, right? So that I could actually do what I wanted to do when I was done. And if you're Black in America or in other white majority countries, you do have to live with kind of these two sides of yourself, where you learn to kind of you learn the structures that are in place and how to navigate that. But then you also have to make sure you don't forget who you are and what you're about. So find ways to kind of, write and think about those things while you do that at the same time. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll able to have that congruence between who you want to be and what your study is. And I hope you do find that. But if not, find a way to do both at the same time until you can get to the place where they converge in the future. Because for me, after grad school, it did converge. And now I can, be myself and do what I wanted to do and still exist in economics.
Perfect. So we have quite a few questions left. I'm going to pair together a few. A lot of students are basically interested in being part of revolutionizing econ, which is wonderful. We want to see you in that future. And there's a couple of questions, and maybe we can end on this just by hearing from various panelists, which is, what are the main tools that they should have on their radar in terms of building? And also, what non-econ perspectives should they be bringing in to their traditional econ coursework to make sure that they're well-rounded when they come to wanting to answer some of the questions that we've raised today? Siobhan, do you want to start off?
So let me first say, I don't think you need to learn R and all these other sorts of things that people will tell you about. And I have a very funny story about that. And just a very short one is that when I began graduate school at Berkeley, I was also taking courses in the demography department where we learned R. And everyone in the economics department was just mystified about why I would learn such an archaic old program as R. So it's very ironic to me to now see people rushing to something that circa 15 years ago was really lampooned in the profession. So those sorts of skills come and go, and I think that you shouldn't invest more in them than actually understanding the statistics and econometrics that you need to understand. Programming is just a means to an end, but you really have to fundamentally understand what it is that you're estimating. And I think that's a really important part. So it really is important that you understand the math and you understand the statistics, but that actually doesn't help you understand the economics, right? I think one of the things that we have is we have this sort of technological structure and technocracy in the field, which sort of privileges this technical knowledge. But understanding that doesn't necessarily lend itself to really understanding economic concepts like opportunity cost and trade-offs and elasticities and income and substitution effects. Understanding those things stronger makes you a stronger economist. Understanding math makes you a better mathematician and technician. So it's really important to understand the economics, because that intuitive hit with economics and even econometrics about estimation is really what will drive your research, because you're going to go into uncharted territories. Theoretically, I really would encourage people to understand economic theories of race, in particular intersectionality, and even some of this post-intersectional work that is coming out now among a lot of scholars, which is really having a lot of import to empirical analysis that we're doing today. Those would be things I think that should be integrated into the way that we're thinking about multiple systems operating in the economy simultaneously.
Perfect. Laura or Benga, do you want to come in with one final comment?
Oh, I would just add that, I think Trevon really identified very well the tools that are most useful in preparing yourself for economics as a vocation. But I would also say, definitely educate yourself in other fields and disciplines. And especially if you already kind of do tend towards more humanistic thinking or thinking about history or thinking about, anthropology, like those are very important other modes of thinking, and they may have more work in the specific questions that you're interested in than the field of economics. And you're going to be that bridge that's going to bring a new perspective and, collaborate with other disciplines in bringing that into economics. So that's what I wanted to encourage people to think about as well.
Perfect. Well, I think that's, oh, Benga, come on in.
I was going to say something quickly. History is important because the evolution of, like, we look at things that happen today as static, as almost like the 10 Commandments, but there's a whole evolution that got us to this point. And understanding that evolution can help us to undo a lot of stuff that's happened. And that's something that's been important in my work more recently.
Fully aligned. You can't begin to really solve the problem without deep understanding of the problem itself. So I just want to say thank you for all of you joining us today. A big virtual applause for our panelists. Thank you also to Dante Coleman for providing the tech setup. I'd also like to thank our hosts, the Econ departments of UMBC, Spelman, and Howard, and to the Sloan Foundation for its generous support. Have a really lovely weekend, everybody, and a safe Thanksgiving for those of you in the US. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.